Hey everyone, and welcome to another Learning Tech Talks, where we are continuing to live at the intersection of business, technology, and the human experience. This week, I am exceptionally excited, even though I get very excited for all of these conversations, because I'm joined by Sophie Thompson, who is the founder of VirtualSpeech, and we're going to be talking about VR technology for human skill building. Specifically, you're going to see some of the ways we do this, which, believe it or not, I'm really excited. Well, no, I don't think anybody's going to find this hard to believe. But the VR conversation, immersive learning, was on the main stage for a while, and then end of 2022 hit, and generative AI sucked the air out of the room. And to me, I always was like, what are you doing? This is the future of how we make this happen. And that's exactly what we're talking about today. So Sophie and I were backstage talking about, she's one of the first guests I'm having on to really dig into this. So I'm looking forward to it. Sophie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, well, an hour is not going to be close enough time for us to get into it, but we will get into as much of it as possible. So for those who may not be familiar with you, I always love to hear the background story of where you came from and how you ended up here, because the journey into the education field and the ed tech market specifically is always different for everyone. So did you think you were going to be an ed tech founder from your early days, or how did you end up here?
No, definitely not. So I was still at university actually when we started VirtualSpeech. So
okay.
We started VirtualSpeech originally as the first VR app to overcome the fear of public speaking. Okay. And that was at the end of 2015, we started that and released it at the start of 2016. And we created that originally because I had severe social anxiety to the point that I wouldn't even order my own food in a restaurant or...
Really?
Yeah. So,
wow. So even like, I'm just thinking this, here we're live broadcasting across 9 different platforms type of thing. Back in 2015, that wouldn't be something you would have raised your hand for and said, sign me up. I'm in.
Oh, no way. No way. I mean, if you spoke to any of my friends from high school, they'll tell you that every day in the canteen, I would ask them to ask the dinner ladies for my food for me because I was just like too nervous to speak to them, even though I'd seen these women every day, Monday to Friday for the last 5 years.
Okay. So from an anxiety standpoint, even in environments that you were familiar with, it wasn't even just the speaking. I mean, it just was, okay. So that's a big hill to climb.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I would be fine with people that I was familiar with, like with my friends and stuff.
Okay.
But yeah, so I'd avoided things like public speaking, as you can imagine. Just
yeah, I would imagine if ordering food at a restaurant was challenging, going up in front of an audience and going, hey, now let me go and give this big public speech was probably not your forte.
Yeah, no. So I would avoid it at all costs. So for my undergraduate degree, I remember me and one of my friends used to bribe other people with food so that when we had to do presentations, we'd basically buy them food to be like, can you do the talking? I really don't want to do the talking.
Okay.
But then when it came to my master's, I was having an assessed presentation and I was very studious.
So there was no way out of it. It just, life circumstance was such, you're just like, I can't avoid doing this anymore.
Yeah. And I want to do well on it. So
yeah,
what do I do? So it was 3 months before and I was already nervous, like 12 weeks before this presentation, thinking, how do I get out of this? I don't think there's any way to get out of this. And my now co-founder, Dom, was working with virtual reality at Jaguar Land Rover, the car company. Okay. And really, it was his idea that VR could provide a psychologically safe place to practice public speaking. So we created VirtualSpeech as a way to bridge the gap, really, between...
So you wanted to create a training wheels environment where you could go, you know what, we can go in here, we can do this without all the fear factor of actually being on stage.
Yeah. And working up that emotional response and getting used to that emotional response. So now that's called something virtual reality exposure therapy. But back then that wasn't a thing. And it's basically CBT, but in VR, if you like. Yeah. So you used to go in front of an audience of, I mean, you can start off with one person. You can do an audience of 50 people. And then if your emotional reaction to that is fear, then you will have that fear. But you also, on the other side of your brain, know that this is safe, it's okay. So yeah, it started off as some nerdy fun, and here we are 8 years later. So within months, the app had 100,000 downloads, which if you think VR isn't mainstream or is quite small now, like 8 years ago, that was most.
Yeah, I was going to say 8 years ago that, I mean, again, VR has been around for a lot longer than a lot of people give it credit for, but 8 years ago, it still was very much, I mean, even still, it's a lot of people think of it as for gamers or this and that, but really back then, I'm sure it was a little more of a foreign concept for people. Now, back then when you started it, because one of the things I want to hit on here is what you're doing is device agnostic for the most part. So it's not only in a headset, but when you started, did you start in the headset immersive environment, or did you start on more of a browser-based approach?
So we started with the VR version. So in a way, we almost went backwards. We went for the VR, and then as time went on, we learned that the market wasn't ready for a solely VR solution. Yeah. So then we added more traditional training methods like e-learning to accompany it.
Okay. Got it. So really out of the, which first of all, kudos to you. I mean, and maybe some of it was you didn't really have a choice. But I feel culturally, so often we're in this environment now where we try and avoid things that are hard or scary for us. You know, we just want to how can we eliminate difficulty or things I don't like doing from my life? Instead of going, how do I lean into that, but in a safe way, in a way that doesn't just push me over the edge? And I mean, kudos to you for going, okay, I don't like presentations. I don't like getting in front of groups, but I can't live the rest of my life just not doing it. So you team up with this friend of yours, you go, well, why don't we find a way where we can kind of find that middle ground, which is what I think XR technology for simulation is so fantastic at, because to your point, that cognitive disconnect of it is real, but it's also not. And so I can help myself get through some of the emotional anxiety without having to just completely reject it. And it sounds like you even thought from the beginning, how do we let people build up their endurance? You know, maybe you're not comfortable even getting in front of a crowd of 50 VR participants, but hey, maybe I can get in front of 2 and maybe start there and then build my way up.
Yeah. Like we even have environments now that are like cafe environments where you might just be talking to a colleague.
Okay.
So I mean, I've spoken a lot about the public speaking side of VirtualSpeech, but we do soft skills in general. So all communication skills.
Yeah. Well, and that's where we're getting to. It's not just getting in front of, but that's kind of the origin story.
And it's still a massive part of what we do.
Okay. Got it. And so that was back in, you said 2016. What, you know, so I'm guessing it started as a bit of a hobby project. When did it actually transition into, you know, we could actually scale this and do this as a business? Because I'm always curious when that gear kicked. Did you go into it going, this is what's going to happen with it? Or was it more like, hey, this is kind of a pet project to help me get through this, and by happenstance it grew? How did that play out?
Yeah, that was very much by accident. Like we didn't think we would be doing it now. I mean, we didn't think it would be a business, let alone a full-time job for the last 8 years.
Yeah.
We'll do this app and maybe other people will find it too. But it was when we started to get reviews on the stores, basically, and people were saying how it helped them with pitches, or it helped somebody they know with autism, or it helped them with a job interview, because that was one of the first scenarios we did as well. And we were like, oh, actually, this actually has some legs to it. It's not just us who think it's good and is valuable. Other people are finding that as well. And yeah, we started being approached just through the website by, it was mainly universities at that point. And so, yeah, we thought we'd give it a go. And then we had a grant from Innovate UK in I think it was about the March of 2016, which is when Dom gave up his full-time job and then started working on VirtualSpeech. And that's when we were like, oh, let's try and give it a go. But we didn't actually monetize it until the summer of 2017 after then.
Okay. So it was a bit of, all right. And so, we won't spend too much time on the journey piece, but I'm always really curious how these things come together, because it's encouraging and fascinating to me when people are doing really cool, powerful, meaningful things. Over time, they just grow legs and they take off because, well, it fills a gap. And some of the situations you described are things, even job interviews, like you said, that is a key area that people struggle with. They struggle with, how do I go into an interview and actually present my skills in a way that's meaningful and not just respond robotically to questions and things like that. And that can be the difference between landing a job and not getting a job. So building that skill set, and you're a living example of, it is possible to build these skills. It's not something like, well, there's some people, to your example of public speaking, I've heard people go, well, there's some people who are just really good at public speaking and some people just aren't. And it's like, well, actually it's a skill set. And you're an example of someone who said, well, I actually was terrified of doing it. So not only did I not have the skills socially, I just struggled with it. Yet you overcame that by building the skills. Yeah.
I think soft skills and interpersonal skills are like any other skill. You wouldn't expect to be a marathon runner on your first go. You have to build yourself up to it. You could,
but you wouldn't be a very good one, probably.
Yeah, or you might die halfway, but you can give it a go.
Yeah, I don't know anybody that can just run 26 miles cold.
Yeah, or if you think of like learning an instrument, the first time you pick it up, you are rusty, but with practice, you become very good at it. And with something like communication skills, a crucial aspect of that is the confidence too. So there's no point having the skills, but you don't have the confidence to utilize those skills, which is also where VR comes in.
Okay. So I want to talk about this a little bit because I shared this backstage. A lot of people I engage with, there is still this skepticism that digital tools can actually simulate that real life experience. And to the people who I encounter who adhere to this, a lot of times I'm like, have you done it though? Because I feel like once you have, there's no turning back. So I'm curious, when you hear this, building human skills, what kind of feedback, or obviously you got a lot of positive feedback with it, but what have you seen with this in terms of, you're a walking example of it. So I guess you don't need to be convinced of it, but what are some of those challenges you run into where people may be a little bit skeptical or uneasy about it? And what misperceptions do people have about it?
I would say the biggest misconception that people have is that they're going to feel sick doing it. And that's usually from, say, 3 to 5 years ago, they've gone to a conference, they've put on a VR headset that was there purely to get people in, and they've done a roller coaster. Now, I spend most days in VR, and if I went on a roller coaster in VR, I'm going to feel sick, let alone if it's somebody's first time in VR. So there is a concern that people will feel nauseous, and there's lots of things you can do to mitigate that. But there is an assumption that if somebody did a VR roller coaster 5 years ago, that when it comes to VR training, they're going to feel sick, and that's just not the case at all.
Okay. It's funny you bring that one up, because that is very much a common thing I encounter in conversations. And it's one of the reasons why when I talk to people about immersive learning, I'm like, please, for the love of everything, when you introduce people to it, don't let that be their first experience, because it does create this emotional response in people where they go, oh yeah, no, I can't do this. This was too much for me. I got sick. And it sticks with people. And I've seen people really have to overcome that hurdle because they maybe had a really bad VR experience on the first run. And so they've written off the whole potential because they go, yeah, I did it once. I thought I was going to puke. And then you're like, well, what did you do? Oh, well, I did this. And you're like, well, yeah, I would puke on that as well.
Yeah, like I went flying and I was in a UFO, and I'm like, well, you won't be. You're standing on.
I was in an F-16 jet doing, loops and flips, and I just got sick. Like, well, watch videos of people doing that in real life. They do the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas with something like VirtualSpeech, you're sitting at a desk or you're presenting on a stage. The environment around you isn't
static.
Moving. Yeah.
Okay. So with that though, I do want to touch on this because this hits on another misconception that I encounter frequently, which is people assume wrongly that in order to do immersive learning in a immersive environment, it has to be in a headset, which I would argue it is vastly superior and more engaging when you're in a truly immersive environment, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And you said you started with the VR, but obviously from what you've described, you pivoted and said, well, we have to make these experiences accessible across both. So what drove that for you? And also, do you encounter that where people run into it and they go, well, we don't have headsets available to us? And you're like, well, that's okay too.
Yeah. So the initial drive behind having an e-learning component alongside the VR was because we found that people would go into VR, they'd think, oh, this is cool. And then they'd start doing some training and then they didn't know what to do. And it didn't necessarily cover theory or techniques or anything. So we cover theory and techniques online, and then you're prompted to practice what you've learned through active learning. And that active learning originally was just in VR needing a headset. But now we do also have the option available for it to be via desktop or via something called WebGL, so that if you don't have a headset, or if anybody in your team isn't comfortable putting on a headset for whatever reason, they can still access those practice exercises, get that same level of feedback. I mean, the VR police would tell us that it's not technically immersive.
Oh, I know. I know I've had plenty of VR conversations over the years, and you bring up the doing it on a browser, and you will get certain portions of the VR audience that get very activated over the idea of that's not VR. And I'm like, I get it, but for the sake of argument.
Yeah. So when we launched what we call VR in your desktop, technically it's not VR because it's not immersive. But if you think of it from a customer's point of view, that's how they're going to understand it. So I think we should just use the language that everybody understands rather than being pedantic about the specific.
Well, and to your point, I think one of the reasons that what you bring up on this is important, especially for those of us who are leading some of this stuff. I think the value of democratizing VR by also in being inclusive of the browser thing. I get technically, like you said, it's not VR, but there are still a lot of stereotypes and just stigmas about VR that people think, well, that's a headset, that's for this, that's for that. And by being inclusive of, well, it doesn't have to be, it can also be inclusive of this. Because I run into a lot of people that still think VR is just this inaccessible, oh, that's way out there, we're so far from it. And when you start talking about the capability that you can do through the browser, they go, oh, maybe it's not quite as far out as I thought. And then that suddenly makes something more accessible, which really, if your goal is to drive impact, do we really need to get hung up on the technicality of, well, technically it's not VR because it's in a browser?
Yeah, exactly. And I also think there's a lot to be said for the user habits as well, and as humans, that it's quite a jump to go from e-learning, for example, like looking at a screen, to being inside the screen. And you don't want to be inside the screen for a long period of time for various reasons. So I personally think that you need an online option to do the heavy theory. You don't want to be reading loads in VR. You want to use VR for where it's best placed to be used. And that is that active learning and learning through experience, whether that's with a headset or if it's effectively an online game, if you like.
Well, so let's transition to that piece because it ties to Rangesh's comment, which, by the way, you got a fan chiming in, somebody who's experienced it and really valued that. And again, I think it's interesting. We're going to see, what I've seen is the lines are continuing to blur as the immersive hardware matures. I feel like I have somebody on my team who talks about it, and he said we need XR technology, the hardware, to get to the iPhone 6 phase, where it's, if you don't have the latest model, it's okay, and pretty much everybody has something and can do it. And we just aren't quite there yet, which is why I think, again, that piece. But you bring up a really important part about the active learning and how you structure this. I saw when the XR VR boom kind of hit, there was this tendency to push people into VR environments for large amounts of time, sometimes for activities that just weren't really suited for VR. I don't want to go read a PowerPoint or flip through a document in VR. I actually need a break from that. So because for those who haven't checked it out, you can check out VirtualSpeech and some of the stuff they're doing for sure. Check out the website. But you've designed some of these pathways that actually are what I would consider a pretty holistic learning experience. You're balancing the theory and the knowledge acquisition right alongside the skill application and the actual skill building. So how have you looked at the breakdown of that so you're not oversaturating people with immersive environments? Because that can be pretty taxing just in general.
Yeah. I mean, so the breakdown is really decided about what skills can be practiced. So,
okay,
as you say, if you're reading a document, and sometimes you do just have to read theory. There's no way of making it interactive. So
yeah, you can only fancy it up so much, and then it's like at the end of the day, we just need you to do the thing.
Yeah, and so we use VR only when there's a benefit to using VR, rather than thinking where can we put VR in. It's more like going through theory and techniques and so on, and thinking, okay, well, how can we put that technique? How can we use VR to bring that technique to life? So if it's something like story building, how can you visualize that and make that interactive for someone so that it sticks?
Yeah. Well, like Boss says, Boss, good to see you. And you're doing it the right way, which is where it's where I've seen immersive initiatives go south, is when, like you described, I'll be careful what American phrases I use, but it's like having a hammer and looking for nails. That's the wrong way to do it. Is, hey, we have this VR. What can we jam it into? But instead, like Boss said, okay, this is what we're trying to do. Let's deconstruct that experience and say which components of this are really well suited for an immersive VR environment, and which parts are we actually adding complexity to the user experience by saying, yeah, go put on a headset, get your device charged so that you can read a thing. I don't want to have to go through that hassle. I don't want to have to go through that hassle to read a thing. I want to just be able to click and pull it up on my phone.
Yeah, there's no benefit to reading it in VR. Why would you?
Yeah. So the funny part about this, we can get into this a little bit. I'm curious your take on this. I have mixed feelings, and I think as the hardware gets there, we'll see more time spent in these kinds of things, because in some ways I do appreciate the way it reduces distractions for me. So I've got a couple VR devices, and I actually use them pretty regularly just because it actually eliminates the distractions I have around me. I mean, despite having 7 kids running through my house, if I'm in VR, I really don't even notice it because my attention is very focused, which in a very distractible environment, I actually find that to be really helpful for people. So I think in some ways there is some opportunity, but I like the fact you've deconstructed the experience to really optimize where you're using immersive versus not.
Yeah, so it's used for those practical elements rather than, like, I mean, even if some people do want to read something in VR, I think they're in the minority there. And also, like, that is something that will probably make people feel sick at the moment. Now, that may change. I may be eating my words in a year or two, and headsets might be much more comfortable to read. And I think Apple, I thought they were so clever in their marketing of announcing their headset by phrasing it as a spatial computing system, because the way they marketed it just seemed like it was obviously the natural next step, that obviously instead of reading off a screen, the screen would be in front of you. And that makes sense. But what they weren't showing you having a headset on and the writing being like right up here. They were showing much more like mixed reality where it's overlaid on your environment.
Yes. And I think that's what Rangesh is getting at, which again, it goes back to, I think we're going to continue to see, and Apple getting into the game. I did a whole YouTube video on this one. Apple getting into the game to me was a big indicator of where this is going, because it is going to push what I think has been on the fringes into more of the mainstream of, well, you know what, this technology is going to get there. We are going to see more mixed reality type stuff. We are going to see immersive environments. But I look at my Quest 2, the battery only lasts so long. It's a little heavy on my head type of a thing. It can be hard to keep that thing on for a period of time. Now, when we get to a point where it's much more streamlined, and again, you can do the pass through, I think we'll get better. But again, right now, I think you've done a good job of actually mixing the two so that you have the option and optimizing the best. Here's a question for you. So having run a lot of these simulation things in the past, I'm curious if you run into people's hesitation that it won't feel real, which I have my response to how I've overcome that. But I'm curious, do you ever get people that, you know, kind of are like, well, is it going to feel real when they get into it? Or is it going to be kind of weird talking to these avatar type things?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely people who, when they first come across it, are thinking, there's no way that can actually feel remotely real. And I mean, it doesn't have to feel, I mean, VR in general doesn't have to feel exactly like real life. It just has to feel real enough to evoke that emotional response. But I mean, if I think of some of the emotional responses that we've had that have been quite physical as well, like we've had people who have a stutter when they are presenting or when they're nervous, but in a conversation like this, they don't have that. And they've put on their headset and they've tried virtual speech and their stutter comes out. And they know that those people aren't real and they're not presenting to those people. So something has shifted, inside them, even if they may not have thought it was the most realistic thing. It was realistic enough.
Okay. Well, and that's what I've experienced is similar in that I think the term they use is suspended disbelief, where there is this almost initial resistance where you're like, this is a little, but pretty soon your brain almost just forgets, because if the environment is close enough to the real thing, you quickly, about 30 seconds in, forget that you're doing it. And if it's a well-designed simulation, your brain just is more focused on the actions and the behaviors. But to your point, in some ways, some of the pushback that I've seen around, well, it just doesn't feel quite real. I, in some regards, actually find that to be a good thing, because going back to the earlier point of this is designed to be a safe environment where you have the opportunity to do this with training wheels and build your comfort level. If it's almost too real, you almost are pushing people to the point of, well, now you're actually, this is the same as putting them on the stage. That can actually almost be traumatic versus saying, well, no, let's kind of put you in this environment that's going to trigger those emotional butterflies and those things that you need to work through. But you still know that you're in a fake world, which makes it a safer place.
Yeah, and that you're in control of the situation. There's no real world consequences. And yeah, I mean, if it magically tricked your entire brain, then people would just avoid it in the same way that they might avoid difficult conversations in real life. They just wouldn't do it in VR either.
Right. By the nature of a simulation, I feel like it's a bad argument to have. Well, it doesn't feel real. Yes, exactly. It's designed to be close enough to reality to simulate that while still being safe enough that you're not pushing people too far. You're creating that safe environment.
And that they can learn with that environment.
Okay. Well, you've got some folks chiming in who are adding to this one and this goes back to this point for folks who may be going, I can't be in a Quest, or I can't do this. It's uncomfortable for me. It's very similar to what you said, that these kinds of things, you can sit in a chair, you can do this for a period of time, even if maybe you've had a bad experience, or if in your head you go, I couldn't possibly be in VR that long. I think I can be in VR for a day and not have issues. Got to have a battery pack in my pocket because the thing won't stay charged, but it works.
Yeah. I actually can't spend that much time in VR, which is funny considering what I do.
Oh, really? You can't?
Yeah, like I couldn't spend all day. But I mean, I could spend long periods of time, but I couldn't spend all day. So there's also that element of it's not natural for humans at the moment. So even though I've been using it for a long time, that for me, it has to have some kind of structure to it. And so, for example, I'm personally not a big gamer. Now, maybe if I was, I could spend longer in there because I'd get that addictiveness. I'd have all those nudges coming at me. But
the dopamine would keep you in the headset.
Yeah, the dopamine hits would keep me there. But yeah, I also find it interesting, the sense of time in VR, that time goes quicker in VR.
It's like a casino. Yeah. Honestly, it's like a casino. You go in, there's no windows, and you all of a sudden go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize 2 hours had passed. And there have been times I've been in there and all of a sudden my battery's dead. And I'm like, oh, jeez, like where was I?
Yeah.
Type of a thing. It's almost like going into a different world. It's almost like going into a virtual reality.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So question, and this is just one for you, from Nick on this. So we talked about your journey in doing this and some of the barriers you had and how you ended up building a tool to help you through. So as you look at yourself today, you've obviously built some skills through this. How does it compare for you having used your own tool to help you get there and overcoming some of that? So if I were to, I mean, you're obviously talking to me now. I have no idea what your, butterfly discomfort level is with that. But before this, you said you were doing a big pitch to, like, what was it, the government or something like that? So, I mean, where do you sit now on the getting in front of a big group and engaging with people?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And actually now when I speak, and especially because of the topic I'm speaking about, I feel like there's a pressure that I'm supposed to be an amazing public speaker, and I'm not. But my baseline was not speaking. So if I compare where I've come from, then that's a huge improvement. And someone else's improvement might look different to that. But if I think of the mental aspect and the nerves, I don't get nervous anymore, which is crazy to think about considering where I was before. But I had a real full circle moment a couple of months ago where I was invited back to the university I was studying at when I started VirtualSpeech to speak at a graduation ceremony. So when I was studying there 7, 8 years ago, I started VirtualSpeech because I couldn't speak. And then I went back and I spoke in front of 1,400 people. And I was almost doubting myself that I wasn't nervous. Like the day before, I was thinking, I should really be nervous by now. But yeah, no, it doesn't really faze me now.
Okay. Well, so one of the things that's interesting about that, and I think this just goes back to building skills, is I say this all the time. You never arrive. There's never a point where you go, I've nailed it. Like there's nothing more for me to do in this space, but you can continue refining and getting better at things. Cause I think of your story and I think to your point, your baseline was, well, I don't get in front of people because I'm just flat out not comfortable with it. To now you can get in front of 1,400 people. And while you may say, I'm not maybe the best speaker in the world, but I don't worry about, I have been able to overcome that. That actually then allows you to further refine your skills, because then instead of focusing on how do I overcome the fear of doing this, now you can start to go, well, how do I, build the skills to, maybe improve my overall, the way I deliver or the words that I use or things like that. So I think in many ways it's about how you're continuing to build skills. So I think it's awesome that you have your own story with this. You weren't this novel speaker that just did all this stuff and then you went, I'll create an app to make other people better.
Yeah, no, I was very much learning along the way as we were creating it.
Okay. So with that, one of the things that this will get to a question, Filippo, that you asked here. I want to transition to how you're seeing this change as well, because this to me is, I said this in the beginning, when the generative AI thing hit at the end of last year, I went, this is going to change the market. How are you seeing AI start to play into this? Because what we've been talking about in some regards has been possible for a lot longer than, you were doing it, like you said, you started this back in 2016. So it's not even like, well, we just started this 6 months ago. But how have you seen, and maybe not even just starting with the 2022, how has your product evolved to continue advancing and improving this, maybe going all the way back?
Oh, wow. So yeah,
like where did you start? Where did you start with it, and where did it keep building towards?
So we started off quite basic, if you like, with the VR environments. And it was more about just giving people a place to practice rather than being interactive or training. And over time that evolved. And then we brought in the course component where we now have about 30 different courses that all have that e-learning and VR component.
So it started with just the active learning. And then you went, hey, there's other components, knowledge components, theory components that we should then bolt on, so that maybe part of the reason your skill isn't there is because you don't know what to do. So then that was kind of phase 2.
Yeah. So I guess phase 1 was giving people the ability to practice, but it was missing that learning side. So then we added the learning side. So then you had the learning, but the active learning in the practice too. Okay. And then I would say probably the biggest development of the last few years is integrating generative AI into the platform. Okay. I mean, I said to you when we were backstage that for the last, say, 5 years, the most requested feature has been to have free-flowing conversations, and the tech just wasn't there before.
Audience engagement type of thing, where people are participating, which you could do in the past, but it was, I mean, like you said, it wasn't there. It was not, it did not feel realistic.
Yeah. Whereas now, for example, if you're delivering a presentation in virtual speech, after a certain amount of time, an avatar will put their hand up, and you can choose to ignore them or you can click on them, and they will ask you a question about the presentation that you're giving. So it's entirely personalized and unique to each different learner, depending what they're speaking about. We can do things like have interactive interviews, for example, where the question is based on your response. And then we can
actually do follow-up questions.
Yeah, you can actually do real follow-up questions, like in a real interview. And we've also just added the like a perfect AI, like an ideal, not perfect, an ideal response that AI has generated. So for those more generic questions that you might get asked at an interview, like, how did you hear about this job? Then you might give an answer to that, but then the AI will say, like, give you your score for that and give you some feedback. And as part of the feedback, it will say, here's an example answer that you could have given. And so it's all very much reactive now, whereas before everything had to be pre-programmed, was more difficult to personalize because you'd have to go back end to customize everything. Whereas now it's very easy for people on the virtual speech platform to customize it towards their needs. So, I mean, a sales pitch, for example, if you're pitching software, it's very different to, I don't know, pitching furniture in a store. And now it doesn't matter which side of the fence you are there, you can still use virtual speech to practice that because you just tell the software what you're practicing.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting, we're talking about personalized learning here. And to me, this is one of, I talk a lot about the AI space, but this to me is one of the most exciting components of artificial intelligence, is its ability to scale and personalize things in ways that just truly were never possible. I think of some of the examples that you gave, whether it's a job interview or whether it's a presentation, any of those simulations. I mean, I've done simulation design for a long time, and they were very time consuming. It was like trying to build a choose your own adventure. You had to try and predict all the different possibilities and all the outcomes, and there really was no scalable way to do it. So even a really well-designed sim in some ways did feel somewhat robotic, because you're like, well, if I take this pathway, then I go here. And then if I do this, then that happens. Or you would just genericize things so much so that it was like, well, you know, for example, presentation. Could you have built a simulated or an interactive presentation in the past without generative AI? Maybe, but the questions from the audience most likely would have been very generic. You know, can you tell me more about that? What is your passion about? It would have been that kind of stuff, versus with generative AI, it can actually analyze what you're presenting in real time. And that audience participation, like a human, would be someone who has listened to what you said, constructed a real question based on that, and then actually push that back to you.
Yeah, exactly. So it's much more realistic, and I mean, this has all only happened in the last, less than a year. So, I mean, a year ago, that's exactly what we had. We had audience questions that would be at the end. It would be 5 pre-programmed questions designed to be generic and fit with any presentation. Yep. And while that practice is better than nothing.
Better than nothing. Certainly better than nothing.
That's kind of level 1. And now we're at level 2 of these are legitimate questions the audience could genuinely ask you based off what you have said.
Yeah. Well, and, going back to this goes back to some of the underpinning skills with some of these human skills that we're talking about, because really giving a presentation skills to me is a whole boutique of skills. It's not just one thing. It's not just about your ability to deliver a message. It is also, like you said, some of these examples of it's your ability to interact and engage with someone on the other side who may have a follow-up question. It's a matter of knowing your subject matter enough that if somebody asks you something, it's your critical thinking skills to be able to take a question that maybe is a little more abstract and go, well, now how would I apply this in different ways? And that really was very, very difficult to do pre-AI.
Yeah, definitely. And even if we strip back to that like level 1, things like being able to measure eye contact in VR and the benefits of that for including your audience in your message and so on, that being able to practice that and get feedback and see where you've been looking. I mean, before we would do practice in front of the mirror, but we'd always be biased one way or another.
Of course. If you ask anybody, are you good at eye contact? Most people are going to go, yeah, of course I am.
Yeah. And especially if you're looking
but
in a mirror.
Do other people think you're good at eye contact? Do other people actually feel like you're looking at them and engaging with them? And so what are some of the capabilities? Because we just talked about one. So like dynamic responses to things, which it's funny. Unfortunately, some of the users who comment in, they have a security setting. I can't see your name. So LinkedIn user, whoever you are, I thought this was great because I can see that really shocking a user where you're going into a simulation thinking, I'm just going to give this presentation. And then all of a sudden the audience asks you a legitimate personalized question and you go, well, I mean, it takes your learning to a whole nother level of active learning, because now it's no longer just I practiced my script in my head and now I'm delivering it. Mm-hmm. Now you actually have to critically engage with things. But what are some other areas that you're looking at enhancing the realism of that to make it more dynamic and more realistic?
Yeah, so the next step is around the responsiveness of avatars in their body language. So we've started this, and there are early versions of this in the app now. But for example, if you're speaking too quietly or too monotone, then the avatars might start talking to each other because they're bored. And it's up to you to get their attention back, or having those kinds of things. Or occasionally, for example, they'll get their phone out, and that may or may not mean that they're bored, because people are just addicted to their phones anyway, regardless of what they think of someone's presentation. But those things like that. So the avatars started off by being very encouraging, which is the idea, is to make people feel safe so they would nod, but they'd be on a 30-second or minute loop of nodding or lifting up their mug of tea or something, or coffee if you're in America. So it's things like that people's phones going off and them actually picking up the phone, which isn't as helpful in terms of actual learning, but it adds to that realism.
So I'm going to challenge you on that, because going back to this, these are the kind of multi-dimensional. I spend a lot of time studying human skills, and they are far more complex than we often realize. And we think, oh, well, there's just presentation skills or communication skills. And actually, there is a whole suite of things inside of that you often overlook. So I even think of what you just described there, of the avatar engagement and their ability to, one, assess what you're doing, and if you're too quiet, or again, if you're repeating yourself. This is where generative AI just turns up the volume. If you're just repeating yourself or saying the same things, or the way you're delivering is very monotone, teaching people how to read a room and see how are people engaging, that's a skill. And that really is a powerful human skill when it comes to influence. I know that some of the different skills that you have in your program, even some of them are giving a pitch. I can see the potential for, if you're in sales and you're delivering a pitch, you better be paying very close attention to how are these people reacting and responding to you? Because if they're checking their phone or not reacting or just nodding their head, you need to be doing something about that. And that's something that goes beyond just the words you say or how intelligent your responses are back to them.
Yeah, you're right, Chris. I take it back. No, I totally agree. In all seriousness, I totally agree, because there's that body language element. And for example, when someone's writing notes, like, why are they writing that note? That has interested them, or they've got a question about that topic. So then how do you adjust your pitch or questions based on that?
It's huge.
Yeah.
It's huge. And when you start unpacking this, I did a YouTube video just on my YouTube channel about this, that to me, AI is, if used right, is one of the most powerful tools for building human skills, which is ironic that technology is the best tool for building human skills. But if you're using it in the right way, it can be dramatically powerful in helping you in some of these things if you know how to refine it and how to point it. And so I have to imagine on the back end, so I love that you're adding the reactivity and the dynamic engagement. I think just continuing to enhance that with the avatars is a huge component. I really think that's going to further enhance, again, some of those on the side. What about on the measurement side of things? Like, how are you using this to help people know? Because anybody can give, I don't know many people, well, I guess you'll see two sides of it. Somebody will go give a speech, you'll talk to one person and they'll go, it was terrible. You'll go to somebody else and go, how was it? And they'll go, it was great. And they're not accurate, right? Both of them aren't accurate. How are you helping people actually understand, like, was it good? Was it bad? Where do I improve? Because I have to imagine generative AI could be extremely helpful for being much more dynamic in that.
Yeah, I am just quickly writing a note so I don't forget this. So one way that we do that, which is outside, well, actually, no, with generative AI, it's programmed to be more objective than subjective. So the AI doesn't have an opinion on what you've said or not. It just knows if you have done it the way that you're supposed to have done it, or the ideal way, if you like. But if you wanted to add that extra layer, we do also have where your body language is being reviewed and you're effectively being recorded from a point in the audience. So you have your avatar self, and the software is tracking your headset, so your head movements, and then also your controllers, so your hand gestures as well.
Yeah.
And so what you can do is at the end, you can opt to view your body language and listen to yourself back. And then you are put in the position of somebody in the audience and you watch yourself. And obviously it's your avatar version, but it's got the same hand gestures. But
which from a psychological safety actually is a safer way, because some people really struggle with watching a video of themselves. But I can see watching an avatar of yourself would feel a lot less like, oh, I feel really uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can have that subjective self-evaluation, or you can actually save that to your online portal and send that to somebody else. So if you wanted a colleague's feedback on that particular practice, then you can get that too. Okay.
Interesting. Well, and, you know, as I think back to some of the work that had to go into this, you know, help me on the measurement side, how you've been approaching that, because it sounds like some of it, in terms of the feedback and the measurement, this is coming from, you've deconstructed these experiences. You've got a whole portfolio of things you focus on in terms of the different skills that you're, you know, building, whether it's presentation or leadership or pitches, interviews, all that different stuff. You got a pretty broad portfolio of those. I imagine for each of those, you had to deconstruct what does good look like in these, so that as somebody's doing it, there is kind of that general feedback of, did you check these boxes? Did you meet those? Is that an accurate assessment, at least on the baseline level?
Yeah, I mean, for different courses, but also even diving deeper for different metrics as well. So body language is something that we've introduced fairly recently. And part of that is because body language and hand gestures, it's good or bad based on where you are in the world. So Italians use a lot of hand gestures, whereas
really, so you're getting into the cultural dynamics of this as well.
Well, we considered it, and what we've ended up doing is, instead of having a good or a bad score or a mark out of 10, we just say this was how often you used hand gestures, or you used hand gestures a lot, or you didn't. Because if you're presenting, if you're in Asia and presenting Asia, you use less hand gestures, generally speaking. Whereas if you're in Italy, then, I mean, you can just even have a conversation with an Italian person and there's loads of hand gestures. So they would want a high score, whereas somebody else in another part of the world would perhaps want a lower score.
Okay. Well, so what I like about that, though, and I think in many ways, this goes back to, see, this whole thing starts getting into the complexity of skill development, is the way you're talking about this. And I think this is a really important part for, I know there's a lot of vendors that listen to this as well, that when you think about skills, keeping the human in the loop, especially in the AI age, I think is really important, because some of the stuff you're talking about is not necessarily telling someone you're good or bad at this. Is there opportunity to do that in some areas? But sometimes it's simply presenting them with the feedback on, you do this quite a bit. You need to consider this and think critically about that. You know, one, to create greater awareness to it, but also to allow people to have the autonomy to go, this is something that, you know, is positive given this environment or this, while also giving them that feedback on, have you considered this? So I love the way you're approaching it. But I think, again, as generative AI allows us, we'll talk about some of the accessibility stuff, because to me, this is where it just gets really exciting in terms of being able to help understand, going back to tech teaching you to be better at interacting with humans, which is the greatest irony of the whole thing, of how do you engage with people from different cultures? And how do you engage with these different things? How do you engage? We talked about languages backstage as well.
Yeah.
You know, being able to engage. So can we talk a little bit about that? Because it ties to the innovation pipeline.
Yeah. So in terms of adapting to different personalities as well in real life. So avatars can be programmed depending on their prompts and so on, whether that person is going to be calm or angry, for example. So if you had a customer service scenario and you want people to practice with somebody who is very calm, or if you want them to practice with somebody who's very difficult, you can do that, just in the same as in the real world. There's tons of personalities in the world. It's not just one set personality, one set.
And you don't often have the ability to control that.
Yeah. Or you don't know who is going to have which person.
Right. You don't know who's going to be the one that blows off,
you
know, blows up. And you're like, where did that come from?
Or if you're having a difficult conversation, like a negative performance review, you don't know how receptive somebody is going to be to that feedback. So there's that element of increasing communication skills with different types of people. But then also, with the addition of generative AI, we've been able to now add role play conversations and all of these AI interactions actually in other languages too. So those GPT-enabled scenarios are now available in 8 languages on VirtualSpeech, and we will likely be adding more over time as well. And that's just opened up, I mean, from a VirtualSpeech level, it's opened up the accessibility to the market, but also from a company level. For example, we work with Deutsche Telekom in Germany, and a lot of their employees do speak English, but for most of them, it's not their native language. So they can now practice in their native language of German, Hungarian, etc. That they don't have to just practice in English now. They can practice in their native tongue, which actually might be more realistic if they actually give more presentations to their fellow Germans in their team. So, Well,
and, you know, bringing that up from an accessibility standpoint, I think this is a huge thing that I'm excited about with its capability, because again, I understand it being a practitioner that often languages is a very difficult, and historically has been a difficult thing to scale, because it's been like, I mean, we only have so many dollars for translation services and all these other things. And the other thing I've seen on a global level is a lot of times you'll run into folks, they can read English, you know, that it's a little more accessible. I can read English. I can, you know, if I'm looking at something, I can kind of pick up on that type of thing, subtitles. But if you're actually asking me to do active learning, that isn't an area that I'm necessarily as comfortable with, because now you're actually asking me to have a human dynamic interaction with someone. And that may be something I can read English. Maybe I can speak it in basic terms, but to actually sit and engage in different ways, it's not really realistic. And it's also not realistic to my environment, because to your point, if you're in Germany, you're probably not having a lot of English conversations with your German colleagues type of a thing. And I think that's where it really opens up the floodgates for, hey, now you can actually provide people with this. But you got to share the insight you had with people using it to actually improve their language skills.
Yeah. So this was an unexpected byproduct of adding languages, is that some people are using virtual speech now to practice their language skills. So if they don't speak much English, they'll now use virtual speech in our AI avatars to have a free-flowing conversation with them and practice their English oral skills. And similar with languages like French, Spanish, German, Portuguese, that actually it's helping people to learn those languages because they can have a free-flowing conversation with a French avatar on demand. They don't have to find a French pen pal or sign up to something online and book a time with somebody. They can actually just drop into French AI.
No, it's a happy little accident that you discovered, which there you go. The recommendation there is you can create another product spinoff and have virtual speech for language learning. So with that one question I have for you, because I knew we were going to run out of time on this, is when it comes to a lot of this capability, one of the things that for me really stands out, and I'm curious how you're handling this, is, I think of your journey, and your journey was one where you started being just uncomfortable even getting in front of people, to now you can do that. But there's a lot of steps along the way. And when you see skill building, it's very much, it goes like this, and you go up and you crash down and you do all these different things. So some of the things we're talking about is creating an environment where you are getting closer and closer and closer to real life. What kind of flexibility do people have to be able to turn on or turn off some of that functionality? So if it is too intense, they can dial it back.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can still just go into virtual speech and just practice getting used to that feeling of all eyes on you. You can actually just use it without any of this. To get the feedback on your presentation, you have to click Start Analyze, and then it will start analyzing. If, for example, the avatar is going to ask you a question, they don't just randomly come out with it. He'll just put his hand up, and you can just, him or he or
choose to ignore it.
Yeah, the first one is a he. That's why I said he. So he puts his hand up, and you can just ignore him and carry on. You can choose to upload your own slides, or you can use a set of slides or a speech that we've uploaded in there. So really, if you are a beginner, you may just use it
the
for
basics.
But then if you're more proficient in public speaking, leadership, sales, that's when you might have more of the GPT conversations, the GPT questions, some of those distractions coming in, like phones going off and so on. So it's not like as soon as you go in, all of these insane number of things are happening. You can turn on distractions or turn them off. Like by default, they're off, but you can turn them on if you want to test yourself.
That's awesome. And that's why I wanted to make sure I hit on that. I had it in the back of my mind. I'm like, I want to make sure I hit on that at the end, because what you're describing, I think, is an important step. So as you continue on your product journey, I would encourage you to continue with that. Because again, that speaks to personalization. And I think sometimes I see some of these exciting products add these new features, and it's great and it's cool, but it also can be overwhelming for somebody who may be earlier on in that journey and goes, I'm not ready for all that yet. And the way you've described it again, I'd encourage you to maintain the purity of that, is it really allows people to let the app meet them where they are and say, okay, if you're early in your journey, great. That's okay. We can just let you take baby steps on this. And you know what? If you're a seasoned speaker and you're someone who wants to really lean into practicing that dynamic interaction with your audience, well, great. We can do that too. And, that way it can meet you where you are. And again, continue to personalize that journey for you. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that is definitely important.
Okay. Well, we're out of time. I told you I could hit the cap on my StreamYard limit for the day on this topic, but to me, it's very encouraging to see where we can go. And again, I think there's a very bright future for, if we do it right. Problem with AI is it's omni-capable. So for every great thing it can do, it can also do something equally destructive. But I think if we use it for the right thing like this, it can make us just better all around as people. So thank you so much, Sophie, for joining me. Those of you who listened and watched live and after the fact, hopefully this gets you thinking differently about how you're developing your human skills and how technology can actually be a strategic enabler for that. So thank you so much, Sophie.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And we will see you back next week for my 4-year anniversary episode, where I will be talking about all of the insights I've learned over the last 4 years. So we will see you next week.